The other day, a young guy came up to me in the gym who's actually preparing for his first physique contest, and he mentioned that he was on a low carbohydrate diet. And I asked him if he was in ketosis yet, and he replied that he didn't know what ketosis was, which made me realize that a lot of people might not realize some of the technical, let's say, subtleties of a low carbohydrate diet. Let me start by mentioning that there are basically two types of low carbohydrate diets. One is called a ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet, and I'll explain what ketogenic and ketosis means in a second, but a ketogenic diet means that you're ingesting 20 grams of carbohydrate a day or less. That means the entire day you're ingesting no more than 20 grams of carbohydrate, which is about the amount you find in a medium-sized banana. There's no other carbohydrates taken in. A low carbohydrate diet differs from a ketogenic diet because a low carbohydrate diet, you can consume anywhere from 100 to up to 150 grams of carbohydrate a day. It's still considered a low carbohydrate diet. And the low carbohydrate diet, of course, allows a greater variety of foods. The ketogenic diet's been around for a long time. It dates back all the way to the 1860s when there was an English guy named William Banting, who was about 5'4" and about 250 pounds. He was so fat he couldn't breathe, he couldn't bend over, he wasn't feeling good. He went to his doctor. He was also having a hearing problem. I don't know, and he somehow thought it was related to his weight. He went to his doctor. The doctor told him, I don't know where the doctor came up with this, but he told him to keep away from starches. And they didn't know much about carbohydrates, but Banning designed his own diet, which turned out where he basically just ate protein foods, meats and fish and that kind of stuff, and he cut out all breads, all starches, potatoes. To make a long story short, Banting lost over 100 pounds, and he wrote the actual first best-selling diet book, which was actually a pamphlet, but his name was so closely associated with a low carbohydrate diet that there was an expression in the 19th century called banting. Are you going to go on a banting, which was synonymous with going on a low carbohydrate diet, eliminating all carbohydrates. Now let's get back to ketosis and ketogenic diets. Exactly what does that refer to? Okay, ketones are basically metabolic acids. They're byproducts of fat metabolism. What happens is, in some cases, your body can't metabolize fat rapidly enough. So certain, let's say, elements of fat metabolism tend to build up. One of them is called acetyl-coenzyme A. I don't want to get into complex chemistry here, but when two acetylcholine A, when two molecules combine, they become hydroxy. They become a form of ketone called hydroxybutyrate, and that's the main one that's used for energy. There's actually three forms of ketones, also called ketone bodies. One of them is called hydroxybutyrate or 3-beta hydroxybutyrate. In other words, acetoacetate, and the third one is acetone. 3-beta hydroxybutyrate is technically not a ketone, but it's usually categorized with the other two. Now, as I said before, there's a lot of confusion about these ketogenic diets. They were actually been used for years in medical practice to treat epilepsy because ketones can enter the brain, and they seem to have a calming effect on electrical activity in the brain. And epilepsy is a disease characterized by excessive electrical activity. So they've been using or prescribing ketogenic diets, a lot of them to children, for many, many years, and it hasn't really caused any problems. However, if you go online or if you read some of the blogs written by a lot of, let's say, registered dietitians and other self-styled nutrition experts, you will notice they frequently warn about the dangers of ketogenic diets for healthy people. They talk about how having ketones can cause a number of diseases, excessive fatigue, et cetera, et cetera. What these people are doing, and they should know better because they taught this in their college classes, they're confusing what they call nutritional ketosis, which is a small amount of ketones produced when you eliminate carbohydrates, to what they call diabetic acidosis, which produces about 10 times more ketones in the blood. It's basically uncontrolled. It's an insulin problem where you get a huge buildup of ketones. I'm talking about the diabetic effect. That you could go into acidosis. That is very dangerous. It never happens with low carbohydrate diets. So to indict low carbohydrate diets and blame them for diabetic ketoacidosis symptoms is absolutely absurd. So let's get that out of the way first. Another frequent statement about or criticism about low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets in particular are that they cause muscle loss. And some of the people that write that will say, well, you got to have carbohydrate because carbohydrate spares protein. And if you don't have any carbohydrate, your body is going to eat away the muscle. Again, this is a failure to understand basic biochemistry. If they went back to the college textbooks that they probably have dust all over them and haven't looked at in years, they would find out that your body has no requirement. As I pointed out in another video, your body has no requirement. There's no human requirement for carbohydrates. And the reason for this is that your liver can convert other substances such as lactate and such as certain amino acids and such as the glycerol from fat. It can all be converted into glucose. This is the sugar that circulates in your blood. All carbohydrates eventually become glucose, and your liver can easily do that in a process called gluconeogenesis. For this reason, there is no need for carbohydrates. However, and I'll explain this in a minute or so, there is a reason why you would not want to stay on a ketogenic diet all the time if you're interested in adding muscle mass. So also, an interesting fact about ketones is that some scientists, as I said earlier, ketones can enter the brain. You have something called the blood-brain barrier, which is a network of blood vessels that usually blocks the entry into the brain of various substances. This is a protective device of the brain to prevent toxins from entering your brain. However, ketones can bypass the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain. And what some neuroscientists have found is that ketones are actually a very, very efficient fuel for the brain. The brain normally runs on glucose. It's what they call a glucose hog. Over a third of the glucose you produce each day is actually used to power brain function. Now, what it turns out is if you eliminate carbohydrates, your brain can not only get some of its glucose from the gluconeogenesis process, but it also can, 75% of brain energy can be supplied by ketones. Some scientists even think ketones are a more efficient fuel for the brain than glucose itself. And you might have heard there's a controversy going because they found that if you get Alzheimer's disease has a number of stages. The first two stages are what they call the early stages of Alzheimer's. It's characterized by forgetfulness, a loss of thinking ability, and so on and so forth. What they found is if you provide a substance that is converted rapidly into ketones in the body, some of these people with early degree Alzheimer's actually regain their thinking abilities, and it's almost like they become completely normal again. Now, what have they given these people? They've given these people either medium chain triglycerides, which are converted pretty rapidly into ketones, or they give them coconut oil. Coconut oil contains medium chain triglycerides, which again can be converted into ketones and used as a very efficient brain fuel. And you have to understand, as you age, the entry of blood glucose, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the main fuel of the brain. The entry of blood glucose into the brain drops about 10% in anyone. And people with cognitive deficits, like, for example, Alzheimer's disease, it can drop as much as 35% or more. Now, again, the brain runs on glucose, but if you supply an alternate fuel like ketones, you're basically giving another fuel where the brain could run on. And this explains why, if you give people with Alzheimer's disease, the early stages, if you give them coconut oil MCT, their thinking will be greatly improved because you're giving them the fuel they're not getting. You're basically allowing the brain to run again, is what it comes down to. Now, who would use ketogenic diets versus low carbohydrate diets? Well, ketogenic diets are actually the best diet for most people to kickstart body fat loss. It's based on a dramatic drop in insulin. And as I mentioned in other videos, insulin is a kind of a fattening hormone. In the presence of an excess amount of calories, insulin is a very potent promoter of fat synthesis in the body. It's a storage hormone. And when you cut out carbohydrates, carbohydrates are the most potent stimulant of insulin. So it goes without saying that if you cut out carbohydrates, your insulin levels drop down to nothing. And when the insulin levels drop, you're basically opening the door to using your own body fat as a fuel source. So now, in relation to bodybuilding, how do we deal with ketogenic diets? Well, let me give you a little anecdote of my own personal experience with this. When I competed in bodybuilding during the era of Arnold Schwarzenegger, low carbohydrate diets were the main diet. Most competitive bodybuilders use low carbohydrate diets. What we do is we eat a pretty large amount of protein. We'd add a large amount of fat. We weren't concerned about fat. And most of us would actually, the carbohydrate intake varied. In my case, I used a ketogenic diet, but I did it in a special way, which I'll explain in a minute. But anyway, here's the point. The point is that when you went on the ketogenic diet, again, it's basically no carbohydrates at all, just pure protein foods. What you did is every couple of days, and usually on weekends, you would have carbohydrates. And what that would do is it would replace when you don't take in carbohydrates, you basically exhaust your glycogen stores in muscle and liver. And this is a problem because glycogen is the main fuel for anaerobic exercise like bodybuilding. So what would happen is as the body fat levels dropped, the training became harder and harder because of the lack of glycogen. So it was almost essential to go off your diet every couple of days, again, usually on weekends, where you would load up on carbohydrates and then return back to the diet, let's say on Monday. And Monday through Wednesday, the workouts were very strong. You had a lot of strength. And after Wednesday, as the glycogen would be depleted, you would have a little bit of a problem. You could still train, but the workouts, you weren't able to train as intensely. My training partner and I decided, we thought about it, and we said, wait a minute, if we lose this much fat on the ketogenic diet and going off on weekends, maybe we would lose even more fat if we cut out the carbohydrates on weekends and stayed on the ketogenic diet 7 days a week. So we tried this, and I can tell you what happened is after a month, remember, both myself and my training partner were drug-free. We did not use any steroids, no anabolics. What happened is after a month of going on straight ketogenic diet, no carbohydrates, 7 days a week, we started experiencing severe muscle loss. And the reason is because when we instituted this drop of the carbohydrate on weekends, we were already like low in body fat. In other words, the contest was only about a month away. So we wanted to get really ripped. So we thought if we cut out all carbohydrates, we'd get even more ripped. But what we didn't realize is the lack of body fat coupled with the lack of total carbohydrate intake wasn't enough. The protein we were taking, and we were taking a lot of protein, it wasn't enough to prevent the muscle loss. So both of us experienced a severe muscle loss, and I learned a lesson. And the lesson to be learned by my experience is that it's not a good idea to stay on zero carbohydrates all the time. You could use it to kickstart a body fat loss diet. Use it for about 6 to 8 weeks. And another thing, a very important thing to remember about these kind of diets is it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to become what they call keto adapted. In other words, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks for your metabolism to change over from a sugar burning machine into a fat burning machine. And in those 3 to 4 weeks, because of these metabolic changes, most people will feel like absolute crap. You're going to feel fatigued. You're going to feel a little bit foggy in the brain and that kind of stuff. Back then, when I trained, when we used these diets years ago, we didn't understand the reason for this, but today they know what causes these initial side effects is a loss of electrolytes or minerals, because a ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet induces a very potent diuretic effect, because glycogen is stored, each gram of glycogen is stored with 2.7 grams of water. And when you deplete carbohydrates, you basically break down the glycogen within about 2 days of not having carbohydrates. The glycogen is gone. And along with that glycogen is the water that it's stored with. And along with the water tends to pull minerals out of the body. including calcium, sodium, magnesium, and potassium. And you have to replace these minerals. If you don't replace these minerals, you're going to get a lot of fatigue. So that's the key to feeling a little bit better when you start the ketogenic diet. But remember, it takes 3 to 4 weeks just for your body to kind of adopt to using ketones as a source of energy. So what else can I tell you here? Uh, the the type of diet that I use, which is basically staying on almost no carbohydrates 5 days a week or 5 to 6 days a week, and going off and having a lot of carbohydrates, let's say starting Saturday night into Sunday, that became popularized later on by two other people who wrote books. One of them was Dr. Mauro Di Pasquale, who initially wrote a book called The Anabolic Diet, which he later changed to the Metabolic Diet. And his diet again featured almost no carbohydrates 5 days a week and a lot of carbohydrates on weekends. And his rationale was by having the low carbohydrate or no carbohydrates 5 days a week, with a high fat diet. It was very important. He actually advocated as much as 80% fat. That's a lot of fat. But again, no carbohydrates those 5 days. Uh, According to his hypothesis, eating in this way would maximize growth hormone release, which would mobilize body fat, and it would also maximize testosterone release. Having the carbohydrates on weekends would again kickstart your insulin release, and the ingestion of a combination of carbohydrates and insulin would rapidly replenish your glycogen stores. And remember, insulin is an anti-catabolic hormone that prevents muscle loss. A similar diet was also advocated by a guy who was referred to as the steroid guru, Dan Duchaine, the late Dan Duchaine. He wrote a book called Body Opus. He advocated a very similar eating plan. In other words, 5 days a week of zero carbs, carbohydrates on weekends. And he said that this type of diet should be restricted strictly for people that wanted to bring down their body fat levels to single-digit levels. In other words, 5% or less. It wasn't for everybody, and he pointed that out repeatedly through his book. It's a little tough to use. Now, the thing is, as I pointed out, you know, some of the amino acids are what they call glucogenic amino acids. They will be turned into glucose in the liver. And when I used the ketogenic diet years ago, there was a lot of us would go to the drugstore, buy these little things called keto sticks. Well, basically you pee on these sticks, and they would turn purple. And the deeper the purple color, that indicated the higher the level of ketosis. However, when I used the keto sticks, even though I was consuming no carbohydrates, I never got a deep purple cover. Mine was barely discernible. In other words, it looked like I had no ketone production at all. But what was happening, I didn't realize till years later. What happens is if you consume too much protein, if you eat a very high protein diet on a ketogenic diet, remember those amino acids are converted into glucose in the liver. So much so that consuming a high protein diet will knock you out of ketosis. Doesn't mean you're not burning fat. It just means that you're not in a ketosis state. So to follow a true ketogenic diet, you have to actually follow a moderate to low protein diet. In other words, you have to eat about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. This is the general recommendation for people that don't exercise. It's enough to help maintain muscle, but it's not good for building muscle, which is why I say it's not good to use a ketogenic diet long term. Another problem with staying on a ketogenic diet long term is the fact that it lacks fiber. Now, fiber is needed to feed what they call the intestinal microbiome, which is the bacteria in your intestine that has tremendous health effects. It's a burgeoning topic in medicine. For one thing, it's involved with 99% of immune response. It's very, very dangerous to cause an imbalance of bacteria in the intestine, and this is what happens when you eliminate fiber. Not only do you get constipated, but you also cause, again, an imbalance of intestinal bacteria, which will eventually lead to some severe health problems. I'll finish off this topic by mentioning a very recent study that actually hasn't yet been published, but I found it very interesting. What they found is they gave a group of healthy people the caffeine tablets. They crushed them up and gave it to them. And they gave me the two doses. One dose was the equivalent to 2 cups of coffee. The other was the equivalent to 4 cups of coffee. Now they gave these people this level of caffeine, and they had them eat a breakfast that contained 85 grams of carbohydrates. That's way too high to produce any type of ketosis effect. That is not either a low carb or a ketogenic diet. Despite this, the two doses of caffeine increased ketone production. The 2 cups, the equivalent of 2 cups of coffee in terms of caffeine, increased ketone production by 88% over baseline, whereas ingesting the caffeine equivalent of 4 cups of coffee increased the ketone production by 116% over baseline. Now, this is an interesting finding because it indicates you can actually produce ketones even without being on a ketogenic diet. Now, although it wasn't done in this study, I imagine that if you added another source of, let's say, pre-ketones like medium chain triglyceride or coconut oil, and added that to the coffee, you would get even greater ketone production. Now, why would this be of interest? Because among other effects, ketones are very anti-catabolic. They help to prevent muscle loss. But again, as I pointed out earlier, if you stay on a zero carbohydrate diet too long, the ketones will not be sufficient, especially if you are low in body fat, the ketones will not be sufficient to prevent muscle loss. So ketogenic diets are best for short-term use. One other thing I want to mention, without getting into detail, because I'm going to cover this in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, is that there are now what they call, or about to be introduced, ketone ester supplements. Now, what are ketone ester? Basically, as they are described, they're ketones in supplement form. They're probably best reserved for endurance athletes because what they do is they help you utilize intramuscular fat. That's the fat that's stored in the muscle. Intramuscular fat is very dangerous in people that don't work out because it's related to insulin insensitivity and diabetes. However, in active people, intramuscular fat is what they call a labile source of fuel during exercise. A lot of the fat that you burn when you work out is actually intramuscular fat. So if a ketone supplement can allow you to tap into intramuscular fat more readily, it would be great for extended exercise like endurance. It won't do much for weight training, for workouts that say under 2 hours. In fact, I would not even recommend it for weight training under 2 hours because ingesting a ketone supplement will block the use of fat, body fat, as a source of energy because you're supplying a readily available source of energy in the form of ketones, and your body will not utilize your fat. And in addition to that, supplying outside source of ketones also blocks the catecholamine. Well, it gets a little complicated, but it blocks the release of fat from fat cells. So you don't want to take ketones during a weight workout. I don't recommend it, no matter what you read on the internet. I'm going to have a huge article on this ketone ester supplements. I go into a lot more detail than I can go into a video like this. I strongly suggest if you want more information on nutrition, supplements, ergogenic aids, anti-aging, fat loss, and hormonal therapy, subscribe to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. 40 to 50 pages of zero advertisements, in-depth information, no bull, pure evidence-based facts, easily understood, no technical terms. And if I do include technical terms, I will explain it. I don't assume everybody has a PhD who's reading my newsletter. I guarantee you will learn something from it. Well, that's about it, I guess. So take care. See you later.